And we are live. This is Tuesday night, July 2nd, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Year of our Lord Buddha. Or somebody else's Lord, I guess, in that case. And I'm hosting Ethan Nichtern, who's here with Brittany, and spending a couple of days, so I invited him to join us for this Dharma gathering. The topic that I thought actually, and then
I had no choice.
Ethan had nothing to say about it, which tells you something about how things run around here. But is really the notion of lineage and transmission in the Buddhist teachings, and particularly the sort of, to wrap that into a father and son dialogue. And I thought I'd start it by just explaining that Ethan and I both study in the same lineage, which is not really, I just want everybody to know there was no forced march in our family. Do you think? Was it?
No, there wasn't.
Yeah.
There wasn't.
It was an interesting evolution, even as far as I'm concerned. Ethan spent the first 2 years of his life living with us at Karma Chilling when I was the director of Karma Chilling in Vermont. So maybe the early imprint was pretty strong. And I studied, as most of you know, with a teacher named Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And he is the father of the current holder of the Shambhala lineage, Sakyong Mipham Rinpoche. And I would say one of the things we'll explore is, our relationship to our teachers and how that might be the same or different. I also study with Sakyong Mipham Rinpoche as the continuity of the Shambhala teachings. So that particular lineage has become a family lineage. It's not always the case with Buddhism that the biological heirs become the Dharma heirs. And so in this case, that's sometimes that's the case. And in Shambhala, that is the case. So what's interesting to me, and what I thought we could take a look at, is what was it like for me studying with Trungpa Rinpoche and really seeing the inception of the Shambhala Theravada teachings in the West. And then for Ethan to just kind of glide into it in a certain way. And it becomes his inheritance as well. And as I say, and maybe Ethan can back me up on this, there was no attempt on my part, as far as I'm aware, to see that happened. I thought he would have his own journey and his own exploration. So it's come to be the case that now we're also Dharma brothers, in a sense, father and son, but also Dharma brothers, because we're studying in the same lineage and we're both teachers in that lineage. So a lot of our relationship is kind of on that kind of footing. So Ethan, do you want to jump in and just say a little something about the background of this whole situation? Anything you want to
Sure.
say?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Dad. I think I'm the second guest on your show, right? Krishna Das was the other. So.
Yes.
So thank you for having a completely unmusically talented guest. And it's great to be out here with you. And I hear this is the place where it's at on Tuesday nights. I'm often teaching at the New York Shambhala Center on Tuesday nights. But I was recently in Austin, and a couple of friends and students there said they tune in every Tuesday. So you're big in Texas. And I'm really happy to be here. I mean, I think there's some ways in which the topic of lineage and transmission and how time passes and continuity works in the Buddhist tradition, in some ways it's a very linear progression, and I think there's an interesting symmetry that you're my father, you and Mom introduced me to Buddhism, and I study with you, primarily with your teacher's son. But in a lot of other ways, I think it's not so linear or symmetrical as that. And I think there's a lot, in some ways, I think what's happening right now is a real need to continue and for Western people to understand how deep lineage is and how much we need to sort of respect that. And at the same time, how Buddhism and other spiritual and psychological traditions are really in a completely new territory, and probably a lot of the old notions of lineage and the singularity or the linearity of it is not going to survive in quite the same way in the 21st century world.
And not only is it the 21st century world, but it's a completely different cultural envelope, which is something that we're going to have a look at together. Some people have, Detchen Thurman wrote in and earlier and pointed that out, that that's a very important consideration. So I just want to say, just as a little insert, there might be some people tonight who haven't been coming regularly to the gathering. So and as you're logging on, I'll remind you periodically that what you want to do is open a second window in your browser, go to facebook.com/David Nichtern, and there you'll see a scroll of comments, which is will become a forum that you can write in as we go. But in the last half or the last portion of the hour, we'll invite comments and questions so we can all share in it together. And the beauty of that is you can even respond to each other in terms of creating further dialogue on topics that are interesting to you. So please do that and open the second window and join in the dialogue that way. So a number of particular sort of highlights of this topic. I just sort of jotted down a few ideas. But one is that, obviously Buddhism, Ethan, is a highly ritualistic and formal practice. It's not just, hey, everybody do what you... It's not a free-for-all at all. Mm-hmm. It is probably, in my opinion, the strangest blend of extreme form and kind of wildness, in a way, in terms of like the extreme spontaneity that the great teachers seem to develop, but with the most articulated forms of that rival any kind of ritual form in any tradition that we have. And so I wanted to ask your opinion, how important you think the rituals are, which are the traditional forms, and as opposed to how much that contrasts with the essence or the pith instructions that are embodied in there, and what your feeling is about that.
Yeah. It's a really interesting question. I mean, obviously, if you study different Buddhist traditions, they all have a different approach to ritual and form, and also the relationship between form and spontaneity. And each lineage, it's interesting, is very formal about certain aspects and not at all formal about other aspects. And but each one has this really interesting blend of spontaneity and ritual. And, I think in terms of importance, this was a big question. For example, we're both senior teachers in the Shambhala lineage, which has its own forms, etc., some of which are very modern and some of which are very old. But when you enter a Shambhala center, you definitely feel like you're entering a formalized space. And so when the Interdependence Project started, there's a lot of different reasons the Interdependence Project started, but we felt it was really important to have a very minimal form space at the beginning, mm-hmm. so that people could just experience the more practice or ethical or philosophical aspects of the teachings, and then the forms could be built on to that. And I think, there's different aspects of form that, and the relationship between form and formlessness. But one of the reasons I think it's so important to balance is that you need some kind of structure to show up for and be accountable to. And also there's some aspect of actually participating in something larger than oneself, so that it's not just a do-it-yourself approach to everything. I mean, it's tricky because in some ways the Buddha himself was kind of a DIY guy. He went off on his own, but he went off on his own after really establishing a tremendous discipline, and similar stories are told about Chogyam Trungpa, for example, that he was wild and sort of freeform in the early 1970s, which you would know how true that was, when he came to the United States in terms of his teaching and practice style, how he had people meditate, what the meditation hall looked like, what the cultural forms of his tradition were, that he was very kind of spontaneous in a lot of ways. But that was also the result of this incredibly rigorous early childhood monastic training, which was incredibly formalized. So he kind of earned his freedom. And I kind of feel like, for me, there's sort of a a need to earn formlessness through participating in forms, that you have to really understand forms. And at the same time, though, I think one of the interesting things about form and ritual is we live in this very postmodern era, and I think one of the aspects of that is a lot of intelligent people who are naturally drawn to Buddhism because it's such an interesting philosophy and spirituality. They really have a hard time participating in something without sort of meta-narrating and understanding the experience. So nobody wants to do a blind form anymore. And so I think it's really important that the meaning and structure of form in its cultural aspects and how one's mind and heart engages in a form or ritual, such as bowing, to take a really simple form, is actually explained while it's happening, rather than sometimes it seems like in Buddhist traditions the approach is do the form and then figure out what it means afterwards. And I think that works better in older societies, both West or East. I think there's something about the sort of deconstruction intellectual era that we live in, the sort of, the blogging era, where people are really analyzing everything they're doing. And there's some great things to that and there's some negative things to that. But I think where it leads is that people really don't want to participate in something they don't feel a personal connection to. But there is always also a surrendering aspect of form. So, I mean, how do you feel about this these days? You seem pretty free form and pretty traditional in some ways. You have an interesting balance.
Well, I just want to interject because there's quite a few new people came online, and some of you may not have participated in this live format before. So I reiterate to just, if you want to participate, you open a second window in your browser, go to facebook.com/David Nichtern, and you'll see the scroll of comments there. And that's where you can introduce your comments, and we'll have, more dialogue-based Q&A in 15 or 20 minutes. So please do join in, and if you have questions now or comments, you can post them up and we'll get to them, or else we'll, really re-invite that a little later on. If you're watching from the archives, obviously you can't participate. I mean, that might go without saying, but, if you're not familiar with how that works, you'll just be participating on playback. But you can watch this and other videos archived, and we'll post a link to that. So one of the things you said, Ethan, is, completely, Ethan and I can talk about this stuff for hours and hours and hours.
What time does this broadcast end?
I mean, and it's interesting that we have a kind of, for me anyhow, I have, maybe I have 4 or 5 Dharma friends, from within my Sangha that I'm very seriously comparing notes with, and definitely Ethan's high up on that list in terms of like looking at the whole picture, the meta picture, the, beyond just our own personal journey, how the whole ship of state of Shambhala is evolving and the whole state of the world, basically, which is something that a lot of us are concerned about these days and have different ways of expressing it. But one of the things I wanted to jump in on was when Ethan said the formlessness, and when Trungpa Rinpoche came to the United States, which, as I think most of you know, in 1970, and for whatever reason, I and a bunch of people met him right away, which I always think of as a kind of strange and fortuitous karmic circumstance. He came to the yoga studio where I was practicing in Boston in 1970 and taught this famous workshop on work, sex, and money, and wore a business suit and kind of fried my brain in terms of spiritual materialism and just like what I was expecting and what he delivered. And I've talked about that at length. But at that time, I think he clearly made a conscious decision because he had all the forms of the traditional Tibetan Buddhism. But when he came to the West, even before he came to the U.S., when he came to England, he had a kind of major shift where he took off the monk's robes. He married a 16-year-old English girl. He had a serious car accident in which the left side of his body was paralyzed. And he started to teach from what is a very traditional part of the Buddhist training, but it's the more open and free form style. And he also wrote a book called Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, and his main early message was not to get caught up in those forms and not to try to trip out on that kind of stuff. So there was a lot of cutting through in those early days, and people, there were kind of parties, and people were hanging out and with him
Parties, huh?
endlessly and drinking and there was very little of the traditional forms, and he didn't really request that we observe those at the beginning, although there was a lot of practice. That didn't go away. And then gradually, over time, he tightened the noose. And a lot of us were going like, what do you mean I didn't sign up for this? I signed up for this freeform thing. And then he brought over His Holiness Karmapa, and he had us all dressing more appropriately and more liturgies and more. And then he formally introduced the Vajrayana teachings in the West. So, between 1970 and 1976, a tremendous evolution happened in terms of this congealing into, in some sense, a more traditional operation, but with a very cutting edge to it. And what I really wanted to say was that Ethan, as most of you know, has created a group called the Interdependence Project, which is, what's the idproject.org?
It's theidproject.org.
So I send a lot of people there because, it is, what's ironic to me is that it reminds me of the early days of our Sangha, in that people are gathering, there's a social fabric to it. There are actually people there who are under 50 and 60 years old.
Hey, the Shambhala centers are doing much better.
Yeah, they are. But when ID Project started, it was a viable gathering place, and also, without the insistence on the forms. Now, the irony is, I would say probably most of the people will filter through that and become interested in the mothership or the source of those teachings at some point or not, but it's not required. But the atmosphere, the sense of inquiry, the sense of adventure, the sense of exploring, to me, feels energetically very, very similar to the early Dharma Dhatus in New York.
Yeah.
So I love going there because it recreates a sort of a beginning without having to buy into anything, without having to buy into any particular form. And it leaves people a lot of room and ground to explore. So I think that's an important point, is that we have to remember, it's just like being a parent in the first place. When parents are very disturbed by their kids acting out and stuff like that, you go, well, wait a minute, you did that, and all of a sudden you're expecting somehow your kids to leapfrog over you and be, and without exploring their reality to just sort of become formalized in some way. So just to remember that there's a process, there, and that it's very, very important. And I guess one of the things Trungpa Rinpoche said about it that I was really struck by is he said, treat your children as your guests, not your property.
Yeah. But I think in terms of the Interdependence Project, just to throw this in, because it definitely has, I think, an energetic vibe of being free form and lots of different practitioners. It's also trying to explore a lot of different lineages too, and also trying to explore the link between Buddhist teachings and Western psychology. So I think it's, in some ways, it's free form, but it's also our online classes, which I'm starting one with Sharon Salzberg next week, which I'm really excited about, and our live sanghas. I think it's very serious. It's casual but serious at the same time, and I think that's an important distinction. And also in terms of form related to just practice, I feel like, I've been teaching now for 11 years, and I feel like I was really trying to introduce, in some ways, meditation and Buddhist teachings to a new audience at the beginning. And I think a mistake that I made early on that I've shifted away from is people want open and they want relevant teachings, but that doesn't mean they want necessarily like watered down or casual teachings. That people want to take things on their own terms, but they want serious practice. And I find actually that often the way, it depends on the person, but often the way to help people is to actually challenge them to do more, to actually step into some kind of form of, even if it's just the form of a daily practice, which is a form in its own right, that people usually rise to a challenge more than they just rise to sort of, you could take it or leave it, whatever you want. That actually saying you can do whatever you want, but you also need to really take this seriously, that's what most people are looking for. So I think people want their intelligence to be very respected, but also want to be challenged to move forward. So that I think that's part of this relationship to form.
Great. Good. So, one of the interesting messages, maybe the primary message, I'm not sure what the primary, be interesting to sort of see what we think the essential pith message of the Buddhist teachings is altogether. But one of them, without a doubt, is the recognition of impermanence. Would you say? Mm-hmm. That's an important cornerstone?
Yes. And I think the first meditator probably, which was probably a couple thousand years before the Buddha, sat down because they were scared of death and had no idea what to do about it, and said, I need to sit down and figure out what's really going on here. So I think that's how to survive and thrive with groundlessness and impermanence is before any concept gets a little bit more philosophically rigorous, just that kind of raw experiences. I think it's the root of any spiritual tradition or psychological teaching, anything that's about how to get by in this world. So, and then I think the interesting thing about Buddhism is we're actually trying to notice what that means moment by moment rather than make up a story to make us feel safe in the universe. We're actually trying to watch the universe change and shift, but definitely trying to answer the question of what to do about impermanence and death, I think, has to be the root of all spirituality. And not to make a bold statement or anything.
Yeah, well, I mean, so essentially we're sort of agreeing that impermanence is a powerful, powerful theme, if not the powerful theme. And also the notion of not trying to cover that over with some kind of fabricated storyline. And like eating impermanence raw, would you say, or experiencing it raw. But how does that give way? How does that link up with this idea of this very traditional, thousands of years old? If you go back even just to this Buddha Shakyamuni that we're most of the time talking about, he's not the only Buddha I've ever heard anybody talk about, but in this era, 2,500, 2,600 years ago, when I started it was 2,500 years ago, but I think I've lived another 100 years since then, and now it should be 2,600 years since then. So, what is the basis for the continuity if somebody's just experiencing impermanence and saying you need to recognize impermanence? The flip side of it, and I always, when I'm talking about these things, I always talk about impermanence and continuity as the sort of yin and yang, of that topic. So, what about continuity? What if everything's impermanent? What is it that's continuous?
Yeah. Well, first, I think it's just good to acknowledge that there is always going to be a tension between the fact that every moment is fresh, and yet we also need to honor and acknowledge what people have figured out in the past. I mean, and there's every tradition we engage in, whether it be cooking or writing or Dharma, it's one's kind of responsibility to be present, and the people who are thinking fresh and reinterpreting and being very spontaneous in the present moment are usually considered the geniuses, but they're also usually considered geniuses because they've really studied and paid homage to the past masters, and it's I think you've insulted a few 50-somethings in the Shambhala community.
No, they said good. They like it. Because, there's an old song that I used to sing with my friend David Grisman called Old and in the Way. Yeah. And I think, that's a whole nother topic. What do we do with the Muppets in the balcony in Shambhala? Do they still play?
Yes, of course. You always need the Muppets in the balcony.
Yeah.
They were the best characters.
Yeah, they were good characters, for sure.
But anyway, there is a tension between the past and the present, because to really, in any tradition, in any field, being a master is somebody who really can show some real, as you like to say, juice in the present moment. But almost always that person gets there from a place of real study and respect and understanding of the past masters. So it's always this interesting tension. And I think with Buddhism, it's even more of a tension because we've made the present moment so much our brand, so to speak, that that anytime it feels like our lineage or our form or ritual is out of step with the present moment, I feel like Buddhist communities are going to look even dumber than other things. Or I don't mean even dumber, but like it's
out of sync.
Even more out of sync because we are supposedly the ones who are the most.
We're supposed to be present.
We're supposed to be present. So if we look like we're
just talking about
living in the past, talking about the present, So, and I definitely, not to editorialize my Shambhala experience, but when I was an early Shambhala student, in the mid-late 90s, and I would go to the Shambhala Center, there'd be a lot of stories about Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche circa 1973. And I was luckily I don't do that when I teach in the Shambhala community just because I wasn't alive in 1973. I was -5. But to a 20-year-old kid in 1998, I don't really care about 1973. And it's interesting for me as now about to be 35, like when I make nostalgic the 90s, nobody cares either, unless it's a kitsch kind of cultural or historical moment. So I think the Dharma has never hit a culture that's this globalized or this fast-paced in terms of the pace of change. And I think the rituals have to get much more flexible. We need really strong rituals that are also made like silly putty because culture is just so accelerating and changing. So anyway, and somebody's asking where my bow tie is. I think they're confusing me with my friend Lodro Rinsler, author of Buddha Walks Into a Bar. So I don't wear bow ties. That's not my game.
Yeah. No, that's really cute though. Yeah. All right. So, there's a lot of I've been around long enough to see how things become traditional. Like literally the Shambhala teachings were terma or treasure teachings in 1976 started with Trungpa Rinpoche, which means they really came out of a vault, kind of cosmic vault for this particular time, but they're old. And as I've said before, he didn't really take credit for writing them. It was sort of more like a channeling kind of situation. So those teachings they have this ancient flavor, but then all of a sudden, rituals were introduced in our community that were English in origin, that were Japanese. There was no influence at all of Japanese culture on Tibetan culture, period, over and out, maybe more recently. But so, and if you look at Japanese Buddhism, it's almost interesting it's almost like a cousin that grew up in a different continent. You can see, they had the same great-great-great-great-grandfather, but other than that, there's a lot of dissimilarity. So, looking at the quality of the Shambhala teachings, and all of a sudden, we start doing these things like, for example, Trungpa Rinpoche introduced a bow that's, in the sort of Japanese style of a bow, which is the hands on the...
Doing that?
Yeah, we can show. And the hands are on the thighs, upper thighs, and you take a good posture, and then you...
Feel your heart.
Feel your heart. Go ahead, Heath. Go ahead.
You go ahead. It's your show.
Okay, well, but you're my guest. We'll take turns, okay?
Okay.
Take a good seat, good posture, and then?
So feel your dignity and feel your heart, and then when you move forward into the bow, it's not a sense of lowering your head. It's a sense of offering your heart forward to the other person and to the space, and the head just naturally follows.
And then you come all the way back up and have a slight moment of pause rather than just diving into the next activity. So it has a really full flavor to it. That bow did not exist in Tibetan Buddhism in that way. There was Anjali, and you bowed like this.
Tibetan Buddhists think it's weird, actually.
Well, because it's Japanese in origin, essentially. It's a samurai bow. It's a warrior's bow. So, and then all of a sudden we say, well, in the Shambhala tradition, whereas that didn't exist at all 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Now it's traditional.
Well, you also have to understand, I mean, you're somewhat familiar with the yoga world. That's right. The Shambhala tradition, in terms of the terma, is 37 or 43 years old, and is called the tradition. And there's some issues with that, but I think the roots of the Shambhala tradition in Tibetan and Central Asian Buddhism go back a lot farther than that. But then you also have yoga schools that have existed for 10 or 15 years calling themselves traditions. So it's even, I think some of it, the downside is it could be a marketing, situation that you really want to solidify your brand, and therefore you claim a certain solidity that's a little bit more malleable. But some of it is also just because we're moving so fast in life that if you've been doing something for 10 years, you have it probably adopted ritual and settled into certain rhythms, etc. So I don't think it's entirely bad that something that existed for 10 or 40 years or calls itself a tradition.
Yeah, I know.
But
I'm not in
danger.
I'm not implying that it's bad at all. It's actually the way tradition is more like a tree growing than it is like a rock. So that is the issue there. And I think the last issue I want to just raise, and these are just some thumbnail sketches, and then we can open the cyberspace for dialogue from you guys. But please feel free to write in your comments as we go here if you like to. The last issue is Ethan and I have talked about this tremendous amount, and it's a huge topic for many of the students that I work with and people I talk to in general, is the role of the teacher. And I had a long conversation 2 weeks ago that I think some of you saw with my friend Krishna Das, and the role of the guru or teacher in his tradition, which is specific. And, I at that time framed the 3 different levels of teacher, and I've done this many times before in the Buddhist tradition of the preceptor or elder, and then the spiritual friend, and then finally the guru or master. Yeah. I'm curious. I had a particular relationship with my teacher that I think was had a certain flavor to it. And when I have been practicing recently with the more updated Shambhala teachings that Sakya Mipam is leading, a lot of times the younger students are saying to me, "What did you have there, and what's the comparable to that now? Right. Where is that now? Where is that kind of very juicy, very direct, very personal style of communication with the teacher? Yeah. Where is that?" So I'm curious, you've had both really, and I'm just curious what you think on that topic, Ethan.
Yeah. I think you guys were a little spoiled, I'm going to say, because in that model, and I don't know, but in that model, there's a distinction made between, in Sanskrit, the Kalyana Mitra, or the spiritual mentor, which is a very important teacher, to have respect for and to seek out, but it's a much more personal teacher who's really guiding you on your path, and that's distinguished from guru. And guru obviously is one of the most poorly used words from these Eastern traditions in the Western lexicon. So guru has a very specific meaning of the one who gives certain transmissions and blessings and kind of guides one's Vajrayana or tantric practice, but rarely in Tibetan history is that a very close personal relationship. And you guys who met Trungpa Rinpoche in the early 1970s had this kind of amazing situation where there were, which I've heard talking to lots of you, that it was a very intense situation too, where in some sense your Kalyana Mitra, your spiritual mentor or friend, was your kind of personal teacher, was the same person as your guru. And so I think a lot of people are expecting that to happen, and that doesn't happen that much. It can happen for short periods of time. In the Shambhala tradition, there are opportunities with Sakya Mipam Rinpoche, who's the main guru, to really be in his presence and have a kind of friendship and personal guidance. But he has thousands of students, so he's really asked us, the acharyas and shastris, which I'm one of, and senior teachers of Trungpa Rinpoche, to really step up more in the spiritual friend role and arena. So I think most of what you got in terms of the personal connection, Kalyana Mitra, is something. Most of what you got in the personal connection is something that a Kalyana Mitra, not a guru, provides. And a guru is really a more exalted position that becomes very, very important when you want to study Vajrayana teachings and practice them. So, I've been lucky enough to have, several Kalyana Mitras or spiritual teachers or spiritual mentors, this guy being one of them, and people like Sharon Salzberg in the Shambhala tradition, Acharya Galen Ferguson and Arowana Hayashi and Eric Spiegel, and studied with Enkyo Roshi, and there have been opportunities to check in with people and really feel guided. Acharya Suzanne Duquette, should not leave her out at all. But it's not always a one-way. It's not always so simple as finding one teacher. And I think that way of framing the idea that one student finds one teacher to fulfill all those roles is tricky and is not going to be easy to find. I also think there's a big problem because the livelihood model for being a Buddhist teacher is not something that there's a model for yet in the Western world. So, in terms of working one-on-one with students or students coming to my workshops, I'm overloaded with how many folks I can work with, and I know sometimes you feel similarly, and try to help people as best I can in both structured and unstructured relationships. But it's something there's a real shortage of actual personal guidance. And I think we've reached this point where mindfulness and Buddhist teachings as a movement has gotten very broad, at least in an initial interest, but the kind of infrastructure for working with somebody on a more in-depth level, I think, is going to be what comes the next 20 years in terms of an actual model of Kalyana Mitra, spiritual teacher, how this could work to really guide somebody along a path in a genuine way. And that's clearly something that a lot of people want. Some people don't want it. And if people don't want a teacher or teachers, I'd say there's probably some wisdom there. And if you're anything like me, there's probably some confusion there too. They usually come together. That's but it's a tricky time because I think there's a lot of interest in these teachings, but the infrastructure of Western Dharma is something that hasn't fully been built yet in terms of this as a real path that is highly structured, that a lot of people are going down in a systematized way.
And what does the word guru literally mean?
My understanding is the word guru literally means heaviness or intensity. Like it's a being who charges a situation with a certain level of meaning and importance, and that's something I've really gotten from my guru. And I should say, with Sakya Mipham Rinpoche, I have had the opportunity to have him as a spiritual friend at times, but because he's so busy and so committed, I never want to take up too much of his time, so there is always that pressure. But whenever you're around him, there is an air of a positive intensity. Like it really, and actually for that reason, it's sometimes, you've talked about this with Chogyam Trungpa, sometimes you don't want to be around your guru too much because it's like eating a very, very rich chocolate cake, Whereas I think with the Kalyana Mitra, there's a little bit more like, I would love to let's just keep having coffee together, or let's just keep hanging out together, because there's a sense of actual guidance and connection. But the guru, you have to be alert in that space for somebody, when somebody's a genuine guru, and it can be intense to spend too much time in that space.
Well, traditionally they say a guru is like a flame or like the sun. If you get too close, you actually burn up. But if you get too far away, you don't get the warmth that you need. So I think that was true. At the end of his life, Trungpa Rinpoche was sometimes staying up for 3-4 days in a row. And if you were around him, it was just all bets are off in terms of your ability to maintain that level of wakefulness. And there was no prisoners being taken in the name of okay, I need a break here. And there was a famous quote, they showed Rinpoche once a picture of the Dalai Lama drinking a Coke, and the subcaption was, the Dalai Lama takes a break. And Rinpoche's famous line was, the Dalai Lama takes a break from what? So the notion of taking a break was really not part of that, and I think that goes along with what Ethan's saying here about the kind of density and powerful wakefulness and sort of demand that it places on you to show up and not kind of back off from that. So that's a really good way of looking at it, I think. And maybe we've covered enough basic points here so that it's good time for everybody else who wants to participate. I see some new folks have joined in. So I just want to, again, reiterate that If you want to participate, the way to do that is to open a second window in your browser and go to facebook.com/David Nichtern, and then you'll see this list of comments and questions that are scrolling there. And you can enter yours, and now would be a good time. So we'll take the next 15 or 20 minutes or so and try to respond to some of your thoughts and questions. We also both can be reached. I'll explain how you can reach us afterwards if you want to continue any of these conversations. Wow, Istanbul in the house. It's amazing. There's people from all over the world. I love that aspect of this sort of international community. Bay Area. David Dimitri is up from Montreal. Okay, so let's look at Jose Rodriguez's comment, and I'll read them for those of you who are not able to see it. I find it interesting that a lot of these, far out from a traditional Tibetan standpoint, are things that I tend to find endearing in Shambhala as a Westerner. The bow, tea, archery, etc. I've been practicing only 4 or so years, and in my humble opinion, as an ancient tradition, Shambhala has gone through tremendous change while honoring and upholding the tradition, the lineage, fresh while steeped in magic. Yeah. Wow, that's a beautiful comment. I guess that's sort of more of a comment, so let's see if somebody's sort of framing something more as a question. Here's one that has a question mark at the end, so let's assume that it goes there. Emma Windsor is saying, you describe the fusion of elements from different cultures and times, such as Trungpa Rinpoche's Japanese bow. I'm involved in Shambhala Buddhism, but I'm also a Reiki healer and practice teachings from the Bön tradition, which of course, if people don't know, is the ancient tradition of Tibet, the native shamanistic tradition, which, by the way, has some presence in the Shambhala teachings. It's part of the thread there. Should I concentrate more on one source? Are things too watered down, or is this simply indicative of spirituality in the modern age? Mm-hmm. So you want to take a shot at that? Oh, I'm also influenced by friends, SGI, Buddhism, paganism, and other faiths. So you want to take a shot at that one?
Well, I mean, ultimately the Shambhala standpoint is that whatever you do in the world is an aspect of your practice of awakening, and that doesn't mean you don't meditate or don't try to apply the Buddhist or Shambhala teachings, but that a person can study many different things. I think some of it, though, is in terms of which lineage or which body of teachings is one's core intention. And I often say to people that one way to look at a path, an individual path, is like the shape of an hourglass, where there's a certain period at the beginning where you're very broad. You're checking out different things, you're going to different centers, or you're studying with different teachers or different sanghas, and at a certain point, and it's different for everyone, you feel like that breadth is stopping you from going more deep, so at a certain point the hourglass kind of narrows down for a while, and you really kind of commit to one journey for a while to really study, so that we avoid this kind of postmodern, I'm just going to take and this happens in major cosmopolitan cities. It's like, oh, it's Thursday, I'm just going to take a glass blowing class, and then, oh, I go to the weekly Dharma gathering on Tuesdays, and Wednesdays are hip hop night, and, Fridays I'm training for my marathon, etc. And that there's something great about that piecemeal approach, and there's also something fragmenting about it. So at a certain point you say, you know what, I'm really going to focus on the Shambhala teachings, and there's a real curriculum, a real approach, a real deepening that has a different kind of wisdom than just touching in with different things. But then the hourglass opens back up again. And this is really, the Tibetan tradition says that, there's actually a precursor for studying different traditions in 19th century Tibet, the Rimé or non-sectarian movement, where this group of teachers mainly wanted to honor different forms of Tibetan Buddhist wisdom, different schools that were endangered and in trouble. And they really tried to collect and practice and study different teachings all within Tibetan Buddhism, obviously. So it's somewhat limited compared to a current Western buffet of possibilities. Global buffet of possibilities. And so, but they were all rooted deeply in one tradition to begin with. And I think that's really part of the Shambhala teachings. I think we haven't gotten there yet because Shambhala is still very small, so it's still trying to establish the trunk of its own tree, sort of, or its roots or its stem, so it really asks people to focus. But the idea eventually is that, there should be Shambhala masters who are also Reiki masters, who are also studying different forms of yoga, Buddhism, art, activism, everything. So I think if you're starting to feel like fragmented because of the cohesiveness, and you feel like I want to go deeper, there's also Roshi Bernie Glassman says this differently. He says you can drill many holes to get to the fresh water down below the earth, but if you don't drill one hole deep enough, you never get to it. If you don't drill one well deep enough, you never get to the fresh water. So I think it's a personal feeling of when do I feel like I have to really commit to something and go deeper. And there's, I think our culture, and especially our kind of modern younger culture, has a lot of commitment issues. Which is one of the main reasons, other than equality and love for my friends, that I'm happy that marriage equality was solidified and protected this week, but so that we could work with our commitment issues. But I think it's really good to go deep. But what that means is really up to you. You're always going to be the person to figure out what that means.
Yeah. Just a few shout-outs. Anna is from Brazil, but not for long, because she's moving up to New York to participate in our crazy New York life there. Although things have been pretty crazy in Brazil lately. And Casey Luber, yay, Casey, if you're still on, great to see you. Would love to be in touch. So we have some wonderful friends from all over the place checking in here. Okay, so let's see. There is a question here from Mariana Luna. Noticing the check-in comments folks have posted so far, I see we've tuned in from all over the world, from Brazil and Argentina, New York, Miami, Canada, London, Istanbul. This strikes me as one of the major developments and, in sense, ruptures in our own historical moment, and I'm wondering, in this globalized age, I'm thinking of our present historical moment, in particular of the political issues manifesting themselves more and more visibly, for example, as protests in Brazil, which we just mentioned, and here in Istanbul, right? As well as in Egypt again. And I'm thinking about climate change and the NSA and all this stuff that's hit our public consciousness in the past month. Can you please speak to the preservation of lineage tradition through this and the coming turbulence, which is sure to get a lot rougher in this age of strife? And in particular, can you please speak to this as well in terms of the role of the student? Well, that's quite a beautifully developed question. And I've talked to Ethan about this, and he knows, I've been reading Al Gore's book called The Future, which is, if you can handle it, the density of it, talk about dense and heavy. But it's,
Al Gore could be a guru.
Al Gore is my guru in a certain way in this area, because the care and detail that he put together, evaluating the 6 primary forces that are bringing this moment together to make it an unprecedented moment in the history of our particular world, which I feel that it is. And one of them is globalization, and another is climate change. There are others, but the notion of globalization is, like I've said this before, you can go online and actually access some of the deepest, and varied spiritual traditions throughout the world just by Googling, And it doesn't mean you understand them, or it doesn't mean you've assimilated it. But, the counterbalance there is obviously, and this is something I think I wanted to throw up at a certain point with Ethan, is this idea of transmission. Is all these forms of input and information do not amount to actually transmission as it's understood in the Buddhist world, which is passing on of some essential pith understanding and experience from hand to hand. That is a human thing. And if we think that's gonna somehow all this information flow is gonna replace that, I probably would say it won't. You have any thought on that, Eth, about transmission?
Yeah, well, Mariana's also talking about in terms of the idea that society might get more hectic and turbulent and rougher. And I think, in terms of carrying lineage and teachings forwards, in some case, if you look at Tibet as an example, I mean, in a lot of ways, that's actually when a society has troubles. It's actually a lot of times, if there's a really good sense of lineage and transmission and care given, that's often what survives, is actually, it's sort of like you take your, what we really take with us, from a scientific standpoint is our DNA. From a traditional Tibetan standpoint, what we really take with us is just the sort of underlying momentum of our karmic seeds. And, in a transmission sense, what we take with us is kind of our spiritual DNA, in terms of society could completely rearrange itself in the coming centuries. And, there's a lot of evidence that it's going to have to, either with peace and stability or with total chaos, especially when you look at climate change. And I think transmission becomes really important because when you try to seed whatever the next generation experiences, it's kind of that spiritual DNA, that sense of actually teachings that open the mind, that allow us to practice generosity, that allow us to live sustainably, which I think that's really, in some ways, I think our evolution is a spiritual one, and it has to lead us to actually living in harmony with our environment and with each other, especially with how many people there are on the planet. And I just feel like really the most important thing we can transmit is some kind of spiritual wisdom or spiritual DNA, because when there are ruptures in society, as in the past, Tibet being a 20th century example, it really is. If there's some kind of strong container for that transmission, then things do live on and move on quite positively and quite powerfully. But I don't think I know what's going to happen with all the coming turbulence. I mean, in some sense, I think we always think it's a little bold and brazen. I think human beings for many centuries have felt like they live on the edge of the apocalypse, and there's a lot of ego whenever I think that way, I feel like. So things may get rough, and I think spirituality is going to become, and spiritual lineage is going to become more and more important as a kind of cohesive glue holding people together as that happens. But in some ways, I think things are getting better as well. So I'm just more optimistic than I used to be.
Good to hear. Judy Worth-Friedsam has a question. I respect the idea of younger practitioners wanting to bring the Dharma up to the present century. And while there is probably some good to this, i.e. exposing Buddhism to a younger group or keeping the teachings, as Ethan mentioned, allowing them to be applied to today's world, I would truly hate to see all the traditional aspects wane. I feel it's so important to study the old texts, older teachings, and perhaps other traditions, lineages as well, if one is so inclined, so that one can have a real understanding of what this generation is looking to after alter or update, or adjust, for lack of a better word. Don't you feel there is something sacred to the old school teaching? Yes, I do.
Yes, I do too.
Well, we answered that question.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Let's see if there's another one. The answer is yes from both of us, Judy.
The only thing I'd add to that is from going back to this kind of postmodern context of the way we look at things. There's no such thing as a teaching without context. So I think when one studies an ancient text, it's really important to know something of who the audience was, that every single thing the Buddha taught, which is the most ancient text we have, which weren't texts when they started, were just conversations, it's a conversation. So it's studying any sutra, it's equally important to know who the student was as what the Buddha said, and where they were, and what caste the student was, and to actually really get a sense of where are these ideas coming from, because there are a lot of ancient texts that if we just view them as completely timeless, which the beautiful thing is they do often have a timeless quality of human wisdom, but if we just view them as completely timeless without context, we lose really why I think certain ideas were expressed in certain ways. There's always an audience and there's always a cultural context to the teachings, and I think that's really important to have that kind of interdependent lens at the same time as timeless old school wisdom. We still have 2 legs, 2 arms, a heart, and a brain, and all the other functions, and that hasn't changed. And so there is such a thing as timeless wisdom, and I do think we need to acknowledge it, but we also need to really study cultural and historical context.
And a point that I like to sort of come back to periodically is as you trace the roots of these traditional teachings, and you go back to the origin, historically, it is always going back to, if you go back to Buddha was somebody who was a complete revolutionary, completely went through the sort of traditional dogmas of his time and absolutely disrupted them. There's no doubt at all about that. His fundamental proclamation of anatman, or the sort of non-existence in a sort of independent, self-existing way of any kind of self at the absolute level, was very, very, and is very groundbreaking. So it's disruptive. And the awakened state of mind is fundamentally disruptive. It's not pacifying in the sense of, like, if you're coming at it from the point of view of wanting to hold on to what you believe to be true. The awakened state of mind is not your best friend, actually. It's disruptive. And so then if you go to the roots of the Buddhist tantric teachings, which is really what we're talking about here, it goes back to the Mahasiddhas in India, who are absolutely, you think we're talking about sort of free spirits or something like that. This would, some of them would be mind-blowing even by today's standards, in terms of absolutely not following a conventional model, although completely, fully participating in the world. So that's really, if you go back to Tilopa, which is the root of the Kagyu lineage and other lineages actually, he was a kind of a crazy yogi.
Yeah.
So we can't imitate that style, but that is the sort of root essence, is some kind of direct perception of reality and the ability to recognize the awakened state in that regard. So, that's worth everybody taking with a grain of dutsi or whatever,
I don't know what dutsi is.
Yeah, some of salt or whatever. Yeah. That, the kind of spontaneous quality of the natural awakened mind is something that is at the root of all these transmissions.
Yeah. Just one more, because this is a rich topic. I've really come to believe that the relationship between how we each conceptualize and think about language in relationship to how it makes us feel emotionally is something that really has to be studied. And a lot of times these ancient texts are translated by people who are really brilliant, but aren't always working through the emotional relationship to the teachings face to face with students. So and without a sense of context. So, there's certain translations of ancient texts which are just horrible. Like attachment, I would say, is just, it's not a good word. And everybody stumbles on that because they have a different emotional understanding of what attachment means for them. And I think when we do look at ancient texts, we have to really have an eye towards what the feeling tone of the transmission was, and that's what is powerful about the ancient text.
Yeah.
At the same time, none of this would have survived if the first 300 years of people didn't memorize the teachings exactly verbatim and use that as their source material. So It is really important to honor that. I think you have to be really good at honoring the tradition and really good at interpreting it in your own voice, in your own feeling. And we have to do both. We have to stretch that much. And
if you follow Buddha's example, you have to be really good at dissembling it at the same time.
Yeah.
Anybody wants to study the Heart Sutra, please have a look at that. he just basically disclaims everything that he said up to then. So we have one question I think that we could sort of have be the last question, and it seems like an appropriate one, which is from Susan Roebuck. And it's a personal question for my guest, Ethan, here, who is my guest for this lifetime and a very lovely guest. Happy to be the host in this particular situation. I have to say it's brought me a lot of joy. So a personal question, if you will, Ethan. What was it like growing up in a home with a Buddhist tradition? Was there a defining moment for you to follow the teachings? I think it's a great sort of, and then maybe we can have closing remarks after that.
Yeah, there were different stages. I mean, I grew up in two Buddhist homes, really, my father's and my mother's, and they had a joint home in my early childhood, and it was interesting. It was I think they were both really committed to being students of Chogyam Trungpa and practitioners, and they would. I just had to get used to as a young child sometimes answering the phone, and a lot of times when there'd be a call from my parents, I'd have to say, "Oh, they're practicing right now," and sometimes it would be one of their Buddhist friends, and sometimes it would not be one of their Buddhist friends, and they'd be like, "Practicing what? Is he practicing guitar?" And so it was interesting. It was very steeped. At the same time, I grew up in Manhattan, New York City of the 1980s and 90s, and it was interesting because being a Buddhist kid, I went to very progressive private schools where you really looked at what made you stand out. So being Buddhist, sometimes without even knowing what it meant, kind of made me cool in that way, and which is good because it was pretty much the only thing that made me cool in elementary school and high school. I followed the cool kids around and just sort of trailed them, but was always the understudy. Anyway, back to the topic. It was, I really developed my own relationship to studying Buddhism in my teenage years. I did my first weekend retreat when I was 15, Shambhala Training Level 1, and David was the teacher. And really developed my own meditation practice kind of in my last year of high school. I would come home and sit for 10 minutes in my room at my mom's apartment without telling her I was doing it, because I really wanted it to be my thing. And I knew I was very interested in Buddhism probably by the middle end of high school, and then it was big heartbreak after my freshman year of college that sealed the deal. So that's often how people come to really know that they're Buddhist. So if that was your path, right there with you. Yeah, and it was really interesting. And this was one thing that David's absolutely right, that he and my mom Janice never forced on me at all. They were very supportive, and I think that's important. They would invite me to practice with them when I was a child, and I had received some meditation instruction for a few minutes at the beginning of their longer practice session. But nothing was forced. And in some ways it was just a very normal upbringing. And I think growing up in New York City at that time in some ways was a bigger cultural force, which is interesting because the Shambhala teachings are all about culture at the same time and studying the culture we are in and come of age in. But I think also it wasn't until I really got older and was an adult and could have conversations with both of my parents in my 20s where I saw how well it allowed them to handle a lot of really difficult situations that happen in everybody's life, but that some of the difficult situations I remember I imagine would be a lot worse if I hadn't grown up in a Buddhist household and had people really trying to work with their mind and develop compassion. So it was really wonderful. It's been odd in a lot of ways, I would say, being a 20-something and now I'm going to be 35 in 3 days. Yeah. In terms of relationship to my Buddhist parents, in some ways, my experience has been you really get to know your parents better as an adult if we have the opportunity to have our parents with us when we're adults. And So in some ways, I almost think my 20s and 30s with my parents are more interesting as a Buddhist than my Buddhist upbringing. But it was very subtly supportive and challenging at the same time. It was it's very normal, very mundane. Not a lot of not too much that was special beyond me trying to make it special at school so I could be one of the cool kids. But then I told everybody I was into Star Trek, so that totally blew that opportunity.
Uh-oh, I guess I'm not cool either then.
Well, now it's cool.
Yeah. Oh, good. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we kind of have run out of time for this particular conversation. So just a few closing things. I'll be back next Tuesday night doing, if you have any topics that you think are interesting, some people have written in, but please feel free to lob those into Facebook. If you want to reach me directly, you can also reach me at davidnichtern@gmail.com. And Ethan, did you want to say how they could get in touch or through your website?
Sure. My website is ethannichtern.com, and if you want to send me an email, it's just info@ethannichtern.com.
Yeah.
But we're on a little 4th of July vacation, so I'll probably have a little backlog, so I'd get back to you next week probably. Yeah. But also, just if it's okay to offer, we are going to be teaching with one of my dear mentors and friends who many of you know of, Sharon Salzberg. It's IDP's first online-only course. We have online courses, but we're recording the first class, The Eightfold Path, an in-depth back-to-basics look at early traditional Buddhist teachings in a very modern context. And Sharon's wonderful, and we're recording the first class next Monday, and it's available starting next Thursday, July 11th. So go to theidproject.org if you're interested in that. And if you're in New York and you're ever not checking him out on a Tuesday night, I often teach at the Shambhala Center on Tuesday nights, and we're going to try to get him to do this in the fall, both live and simulcast at the Shambhala Center one Tuesday night in the fall. So.
Right. And, those of you who are in the East End, I'm going to be doing some workshops at Mandala Yoga Studio in July. Not this weekend, but next Saturday night and the one after that. So I think it's like the 13th and the 20th. So you can look that up. If we didn't get to your question tonight or your comment, I'm sorry. We just don't have the time for it. I'll just close by Lama Luis Riego, who comes very regularly to these. The Sanskrit guru is more like heavy bull in the herd.
Top dog.
So, leave you with that thought, and thank everybody for tuning in from all over the place, and hope to see you again next week for this gathering. Also, these are all archived, so we'll put a link up so that if you missed part of it or you just want to see it again or any of the other talks, you can access them. There'll be a link posted. So I want to thank Ethan for being himself, which is the highest blessing that there could possibly be, actually, and for sharing my journey in life, which I consider a great blessing for myself personally. And wishing him a little bit precociously a happy birthday coming up in a couple of days here, and for joining in. And we'll see you all again soon, hopefully somewhere soon. Okay? Thank you.